From the beginning, New Dealers built a state that was both far more powerful and substantially less liberal than historians have realized. In other words, the New Deal focused more on fostering economic development than it did, say, on more radical goals like the redistribution of wealth. Public works were deeply political, and this speaks, I think, to Jennifer's point about the potential for social policy to mobilize people in the political arena. The New Deal, of course, was a response to the Great Depression. It was also the political program, right, of the Democratic Party, a party that had long been out of power before Roosevelt's election. And public works construction was fundamental to altering the relationships between state building and political party building at the federal, state, and local levels. Let me give you a brief example here. Communities often had to vote in special elections to issue bonds to allow them to raise the money necessary to attract federal matching funds for building public works projects. In 83% of these special elections, communities during the Depression voted to contribute their own money in order to construct infrastructure, relieve unemployment. Or, we like to hear the voices from the past. As one concerned resident of Chula Vista, California put it, to obtain a PWA grant, the residents of Chula Vista, quote, went to the polls and voted to bond themselves in the amount of $107,000 to enter into the spirit of the New Deal. And for Chula Vista, as it was the case for communities around the country, the spirit of the New Deal meant the improvement of local streets by private contractors employing a combination of skilled labor and workers taken from relief rolls, funded by a mixture of federal grants, loans, and locally issued bonds. And this broad range of support for federal public works spending at the local level suggests that portraits of New Deal political culture that emphasize such features of daily life as taxpayer resistance on the one hand, or the role of mass culture in mediating the growing acceptance of the welfare state on the other by ethnic workers, that these are incomplete portraits of the 1930s. Indeed, as Harry Hopkins, the head of the WPA, once put it when asked to explain the New Deal's success, the New Deal was a success because it could, quote, tax and tax, spend and spend, and elect and elect. And we now know this phrase is descendant, right? The usually derisive phrase, tax and spend liberalism. Who am I kidding? It's never usually derisive. It's always derisive, right? We know this phrase. But Hopkins, when he made this statement, this was pure genius. He succinctly identified the qualities that made New Deal liberalism both so powerful and so controversial. The taxing and spending functions of government could remake the political as well as the physical landscape of the nation. And these works programs were both powerful and controversial. One 1939 public opinion poll found that in response to the questions, what was the best thing that FDR has done, what was the worst thing that FDR has done, the #1 answer to each question was the WPA. And opponents of the New Deal recognized the genius, the instrumentality of Hopkins' statement, spearheading the drive to pass the Hatch Act in 1939. Right? No one during the Depression turned down the stimulus, But the big concern of New Deal opponents that they mobilized on was a way to roll back a striking feature of the New Deal order, the massive expansion of the federal payroll outside of the civil service structure. So, in recovering the New Deal's focus on public works and their political and economic impacts, we also can find a wealth of important evidence that supports recent accounts by Suzanne Mettler, Linda Gordon, and others that have emphasized the gendered and racial boundaries of the American welfare state. As scholars like Michael Kazin have observed, the construction industry and building trades were central bastions for white male workers. While the New Deal marked an important moment, enlisting as public servants women like Molly Dewson and Ellen Woodward, and African Americans like Mary McLeod Bethune, and as Tom Segru points out in his new book, creating the first federal affirmative action programs, quotas via the Public Works Administration, the New Deal, in basing so much of its public policy on the building of public works projects, largely worked to reinforce the gendered and racial boundaries already present in the labor market. As the New Deal built public works projects across the nation, transforming its physical landscape, making the case for the New Deal through jobs, concrete, and steel, New Dealers underscored this revolution with their words. and few did it as eloquently as Jerome Frank, a brilliant lawyer who advised Harold Ickes and the Public Works Administration on legal matters. In 1938, Frank championed this program of government investment in economic development, noting that these projects, quote, call for many billions of dollars of legitimate government investment over a period of many years, yielding us lasting physical improvements of the highest economic and social value, and unquestionably supplying us with that needed stimulus to private initiative, which spells public national prosperity. So New Dealers like Frank and others framed the New Deal as following in a long history of using government to foster economic development, with the key difference that this time the people, rather than the interests, would benefit. Historians, though, have generally treated these programs simply as emergency measures that failed to solve the Great Depression. For that, we're continually reminded, as we should be, that it took World War II. But the New Deal Works programs have been for too long overrated as employment measures and overlooked as significant contributors to the economic development of the nation. Judge these programs instead by what they accomplished, not by what they failed to do. And they performed strikingly, developing nearly every county in the nation and integrating rural and urban America into a national market. Instead, historians like Schlesinger have fixed on the deep and bitter personality conflict between Ickes and Hopkins, portraying the works programs as kind of pawns in a battle for Roosevelt's affections. These programs were not, I would say, the backdrop to a clash of egos, nor were they, as another historian has recently suggested, simply, and I quote, Prozac, that's improved the deflated morale of Americans during the Depression. Through its public works, the federal government presented a physical justification of its new presence in the nation's economy, nesting the achievements of New Deal liberalism within the Clinton narrative, leading to the end of reform as a journey away from the 1933 statist intervention of the NRA's industrial codes to the manipulation of fiscal policy in 1937 and 38. This misses the central significance of the New Deal's commitment to public works throughout the 1930s and afterwards. New Deal liberalism, I would conclude, was not simply a federal effort to preempt dissent, as Barton Bernstein would have it. It was not an ideology that we should understand as a backdrop to a clash of egos, as Schlesinger asserts. And New Deal liberalism was not simply the story of the end of reform, as Alan Brinkley argues. Rather, New Deal liberalism built a public works revolution in the United States, and in so doing, this ideology transformed the nation's economy, politics, and landscape for nearly half a century.